Ousman Camara is the 77th person charged in the massive $300 million Feeding Our Future fraud case.
Mr. Clemmer, do you have any comment?
No, sir.
America, Minnesota just hit the corruption trifecta that perfectly shows why this state has become a national embarrassment. The 77th person just got charged in the massive Feeding Our Future fraud scheme that stole over $255 million meant to feed hungry children. Meanwhile, a care facility operator just got exposed for billing Medicaid $1.7 million while a vulnerable man died alone and neglected in his apartment. And now President Trump is terminating temporary protective status for Somalia Minnesotans, citing the state is a hub of fraudulent money laundering activity. But here's what's really pathetic. While Minnesota politicians are crying about Trump's immigration decision, they've allowed their state to become a playground for international fraud schemes that steal from taxpayers and exploit vulnerable people. Because here's what nobody wants to admit: Minnesota's reputation for corruption and fraud has become so bad that even the president is calling it out as the center of criminal activity.
5 years after federal investigators first uncovered the scheme to siphon $250 million in pandemic relief, the number of people charged in this massive fraud continues to grow.
What is up, guys? Tyson, DeLaCruz here. Thank you so much for rocking with me. When your state becomes synonymous with massive fraud schemes, you know your leadership has completely failed. Before we dive into the latest developments, let me remind you that we've been following Minnesota's fraud situation closely on this channel. If you want to get caught up to speed and know all the details about the state becoming a corruption capital, the playlist link will be somewhere around here that covers everything from the Feeding Our Future scheme to various other fraud operations that we've exposed. Minnesota has become ground zero for some of the largest fraud schemes in American history, and today's news shows that the corruption just keeps getting worse. We're not talking about just isolated incidents. We're talking about systematic exploitation of federal programs that have turned Minnesota into a magnet for international criminals. The pattern here is clear. Minnesota's weak oversight, progressive policies, and lack of accountability have created an environment where criminals feel comfortable running massive fraud operations with little fear of consequences. Let's start with the latest arrest in the Feeding Our Future scandal. Ousman Camara, the 45-year-old owner of KARE's Grocery and Deli in North Minneapolis, just became the 77th person charged in this massive fraud scheme. The fact that we're now at 77 defendants shows the massive scope of this criminal enterprise. This isn't just a few bad actors. This is a systematic fraud operation that infiltrated Minnesota's child nutrition programs.
45-year-old Ousman Camara owns KARE's Dollar Grocery and Deli, also known as KARE's African Market, on Broadway in North Minneapolis.
According to the indictment, he claimed to serve more than 300,000 meals to children out of a small grocery store during the pandemic. What makes this even more outrageous, the USDA has already disqualified Ousman from participating in SNAP 10 years ago because of suspected fraud. Yet somehow he was allowed to participate in child nutrition programs where he allegedly stole about $1 million. Federal prosecutors say he claimed to serve breakfast and lunch to 1,000 children each day, 7 days a week, out of a small convenience store.
Now, since he allegedly purchased the building with fraud money, the indictment says it's subject to forfeiture, so the feds can recoup some of the funds.
He also allegedly paid 87 grand in bribes to the Feeding Our Future employee and sent 90 grand to Hong Kong.
However, past cases have indicated that other money referenced in the indictment, including a $90,000 wire transfer to Hong Kong, alleged bribes paid to a Feeding Our Future employee, and funds spent to pay off Camara's credit cards, is likely gone.
Spent overseas, used for bribes, or spent on personal expenses. The fact that Ousman was sending money to Hong Kong while claiming to feed hungry children in Minneapolis shows the international scope of this fraud operation. This isn't just local corruption. This is organized crime with global connections. Now let me tell you about another ball-buster Minnesota scandal that shows how the state's weak oversight allows vulnerable people to be exploited and neglected. A care facility operator billed Medicaid $1.7 $2.7 million, while a vulnerable man died alone in his apartment.
Vulnerable people, an unattended death, and hundreds of millions of tax dollars. Tonight, KARE 11 Investigates exposes new fraud allegations inside yet another rapidly expanding Medicaid program.
This involves Minnesota's Integrated Community Support Program, which is supposed to help adults with disabilities live independently. Instead, it became another vehicle for fraud and neglect.
Rick was severely mentally ill, battling bipolar disorder and schizophrenia most of his adult life.
He had never lived on his own.
Until, in the summer of 2024, he moved out of a group home and into his own apartment, supported by a Medicaid-funded program called Integrated Community Supports, or ICS.
He was supposed to be receiving daily assistance for health, safety, and wellness, but instead he died alone while his care provider billed taxpayers for services never provided.
Records show his ICS provider, a private company called Ultimate Home Health Services LLC, billed $461 every single day, claiming they provided Rick, on average, almost 12 hours of ICS service daily.
But Rick's mother visited him every week and never saw any care workers. He died alone because nobody was actually providing the care that they were billing for.
When Rick had a medical emergency and died alone.
When was the last time you guys seen him or known that he was alive?
Yesterday.
Around what time?
It was yesterday morning.
Time of death.
St. Paul police body cam footage, which KARE 11 worked with the Clemmer family to obtain, is a smoking gun.
I mean, to be honest, as like you do, I do my daily check-ins. I have no idea what he does.
This ICS worker with Ultimate Home Health Services told the investigating officer they briefly check on Rick just once a day.
This ICS program fraud is just the latest example of how Minnesota's Medicaid programs have become targets for systematic exploitation. The program's billing has exploded from $26 million in 2022 to $168 million by 2024. That is more than a 500% increase in just 2 years, which should have been a massive red flag for state oversight agencies. But Minnesota's Department of Human Services apparently wasn't paying attention while vulnerable people were being exploited.
Today, DHS notified me they've suspended payment to this company, citing credible allegations of fraud. It goes into effect December 2nd.
The fact that Rick's mother had to work with journalists to get records showing the fraud demonstrates how little accountability exists in Minnesota's Medicaid system. Vulnerable people are dying while criminals profit from their neglect. Now let's talk about President Trump's decision to terminate temporary protective status for Somalia Minnesotans, which has sent Minnesota's political establishment into a complete meltdown.
In this country, we do not blame the lawlessness of an individual on a whole community. What we also know is that there is not a single evidence that the president or his coonies have put forth.
Trump's announcement specifically cited Minnesota as a hub of fraudulent money laundering activity and alleged that Somalia gangs are terrorizing people in the states. Given everything that we just discussed about Minnesota fraud problems, this assessment seems quite accurate.
Minnesota, under Governor Walz, is a hub of fraudulent money laundering activity. I am, as the President of the United States, hereby terminating, effective immediately, the temporary protected status, TPS program, for Somalis in Minnesota.
When the President of the United States is calling out your state as the center of criminal activity, that should be a wake-up call for local leadership. According to Congressional Research Service data, there are 705 Somalia individuals with TPS status in the United States. While this affects a relatively small number of people, the symbolic impact is huge for Minnesota's reputation. Instead of addressing the fraud problems that led to Trump's decision, Minnesota politicians are deflecting and playing victim. They're more concerned about protecting their political image than fixing the systematic problems that created this mess.
Walz responded on X, saying it's not surprising that the president has chosen to broadly target an entire community.
But he completely ignores the fraud and criminal activity that prompted this decision. This is typical Minnesota Democratic leadership. Deflect blame instead of addressing the problem. Ilhan, I married my brother Governor Omar tried to minimize the impact by claiming most Somalians are U.S. citizens. But she completely ignores the broader message about Minnesota's reputation for fraud and criminal activity. This is exactly the kind of deflection that's allowed these problems to fester. The fact that Minnesota's political leaders are more concerned about defending their image than addressing the fraud problem shows why these issues continue to get worse. They rather play victim than implement real reform. What we're seeing in Minnesota is a complete breakdown of government oversight and accountability that has turned the state into a national embarrassment. From the Feeding Our Future scheme to Medicaid fraud, autism fraud, housing fraud, fraud over fraud, to international money laundering, Minnesota has become synonymous with corruption. The 77th arrest in the Feeding Our Future case shows this wasn't just a few bad actors. This was a systematic criminal enterprise that exploited Minnesota's weak oversight for years. The fact that someone previously disqualified from SNAP for fraud was allowed to participate in child nutrition programs shows how broken the system really is. America, Minnesota's corruption trifecta perfectly illustrates how progressive policies and weak oversight create environments where criminals thrive while vulnerable people suffer. The 77th arrest in the Feeding Our Future fraud scheme, the Medicaid fraud that led to a vulnerable man's death, and Trump's TPS termination all stem from the same root problem: lack of accountability. Instead of addressing the systematic fraud that has made Minnesota a national embarrassment, the state leaders are deflecting blame and playing victim like they normally do. They're more concerned about their political image than fixing problems that allowed criminals to exploit federal programs. The fact that someone previously disqualified for SNAP fraud was allowed to steal $1 million from a child nutrition program shows how broken Minnesota's oversight really is. The explosive growth in Medicaid billing while vulnerable people die from neglect shows the human cost of this corruption. Trump's decision to call out Minnesota as a hub of fraudulent money laundering activity isn't partisan politics. It's an accurate assessment of a state that has lost control of its fraud problems. When the president has to intervene because your state can't police itself, that is a complete failure of leadership. Minnesota needs leaders willing to implement real accountability measures instead of making excuses for criminals. Until that happens, the state will continue to be a magnet for fraud schemes that steal from taxpayers and exploit vulnerable people. Let me know what you think about this. Drop it down in the comments section down below. Smash the like button if you kindly would. Share, subscribe, and as always, guys, I'll catch you on the next one.